How did I end up married to someone so completely worthless? The words cracked across the room like a gunshot. Crystal trembled. A fork slipped from someone's hand and hit a china plate with a sharp, lonely clink. Every conversation died in the same instant, as if the entire Carter family had been waiting for the ugliest truth in the room to finally be spoken out loud. Graham stood beside the long mahogany table, one hand wrapped around a glass he had no business lifting in a house that wasn't his. His mouth twisted with the kind of smile that only cruel men wear when they think they have an audience. His eyes dragged over Emily with open contempt, and when he spoke again, he did it slowly, making sure every person in that room heard every syllable. You're weak. Pathetic. A burden. I can barely stand to look at you. A few people gasped. A few looked down. Most didn't. Most watched. Because humiliation had become a kind of entertainment in that house, and Emily Carter had been their favorite target for years. At the far end of the room, the family attorney lowered his eyes to the final pages of the will in his hands, but even he could feel the tension gathering like a storm about to split the ceiling open. Simon sat rigid with satisfaction. Ava's lips curved around a glittering little smile. Laura tilted her head, feigning pity, as though she were witnessing a tragedy she hadn't helped create. And Emily? Emily sat very still. That was what made them underestimate her. She did not scream. She did not lunge across the table. She did not beg for dignity from people who had made a sport out of stripping it away. She folded her hands in her lap and stared at the polished wood in front of her, her face pale, her spine straight, her silence so controlled it unnerved even the attorney. They thought that silence meant surrender. They thought her softness meant weakness. They thought the woman they had mocked, ignored, cheated, and betrayed had spent years shrinking under the weight of their cruelty. They were wrong. Because beneath Emily's quiet exterior was a memory that never forgot, a heart that had suffered without hardening, and a mind that had been paying attention while everyone else confused noise for power. Every insult had gone somewhere. Every sneer had sharpened something. Every betrayal had taught her exactly who they were. And in just a few moments, the room that had spent years breaking her would learn what it felt like to break instead. No one there was ready for what was written in the final lines of that will. No one there was ready for the truth her parents had buried like a seed and left behind to bloom at exactly the right time. And no one, least of all the man who had just called her worthless, understood that the most dangerous person in a room is not always the loudest one. Sometimes it's the one who has endured long enough to stop being afraid. Emily had once believed family was something sacred. As a little girl, she had run through those same halls with sunlight in her hair and flour on her cheeks, while her mother laughed in the kitchen and her father pretended to be scandalized by stolen cookie dough. Back then, the Carter estate had not felt cold. It had felt alive. The windows had stood open in spring. The staff had smiled without fear. The dining room had hosted stories, not performances. Her mother used to pull her close, brush a loose strand of hair from her face, and tell her she had the kindest heart in the family. Her father would smile and say, kindness was never small. Kindness, he said, was the truest measure of strength. Simon used to roll his eyes when he heard that. Ava would glance into mirrors even as a child. Laura learned early how to cry on command. Emily learned how to love. That was the difference. And that difference had cost her dearly after the funeral. If you love stories like this, do me a quick favor and hit like and subscribe right now, because what happens next is the kind of reckoning nobody sees coming until it's too late. The day their parents were buried, the warmth vanished from the Carter house. Grief should have drawn the siblings together, but grief only exposed what had already been growing in the dark. Simon stepped into authority before the earth had even settled over the graves. Ava aligned herself with money before mourning had ended. Laura drifted wherever power felt warmest. And Emily, who had still been trying to hold on to the version of family she thought could survive tragedy, didn't realize until much later that she had been standing alone almost from the beginning. We'll handle the estate, Simon had said in the study, just days after the funeral, speaking with the crisp impatience of a man who'd been waiting for command. You don't need to concern yourself with the business side of things. Emily had looked up from the chair where she sat, clutching one of her mother's scarves. But I should at least know what Mom and Dad wanted. Ava had sighed, as if the sound of Emily's voice itself were exhausting. What they wanted was for people who understand numbers to manage the family assets. Laura had taken a gentler route, because Laura always did. She had knelt beside Emily, put on her softest face, and said, "You're too emotional right now. Let us take care of it. You need rest." Rest. That was the first cage they ever built around her. They called it concern. They called it practicality. They called it protecting her. What they meant was, stay out of the way. And because Emily was grieving, because she believed blood still meant something, because she had not yet learned how quickly love can be weaponized against the person who gives it most freely, she listened. That was her first mistake. The second was Graham. When she met him, he had seemed patient in ways her siblings never were. He listened when she spoke. He noticed small things. He told her she deserved to be cherished, and for a woman who had spent years feeling peripheral in her own family, the promise of being chosen was intoxicating. He opened doors. He sent flowers. He said she was different from everyone around her, and he made it sound like praise. It was not praise. It was assessment. Men like Graham do not fall in love with gentleness. They identify it. They test it. They decide whether it can be manipulated. Then they dress control up as devotion until the person they married can no longer tell the difference. The first year of marriage had been full of tiny corrections. He didn't like how she dressed. He didn't like how long she spent on the phone with old friends. He didn't like that she still deferred to her siblings because, in his words, it made her look small. Then came the remarks, the sighs, the little jokes at her expense when other people were around. If she forgot something, he called her hopeless. If she disagreed, he called her dramatic. If she cried, he called her exhausting. By the time the marriage turned openly cruel, he had trained her to question her own reactions first. That was how abuse survived in elegant houses. Not always through bruises, sometimes through erosion. A cutting word here, a humiliating laugh there. A room full of people who witness it and call it personality. Simon treated her opinions like interruptions. Ava treated her presence like clutter. Laura treated her like practice, smiling sweetly while slipping knives between her ribs. Graham learned fast that the Carter family rewarded contempt, and once he understood that, he fit right in. At dinners, Simon would mock her lack of business involvement, ignoring the fact that he and Ava had shut her out of every serious conversation. Ava would comment on her clothes in a voice loud enough for cousins and staff to hear. Laura would reach for Emily's hand and say, "She means well," which somehow hurt worse than the rest, and Graham, sitting close enough to be mistaken for loyal, would laugh with them. There are humiliations that scorch in the moment, and then there are the slower ones that settle inside a person and teach them what the people around them believe they deserve. Emily absorbed too many of those. She tried to win them back with reason at first. She offered suggestions about the staff bonuses her mother had always insisted on. Simon dismissed her. She asked whether the family foundation would continue funding school scholarships. Ava told her to leave serious matters to serious people. She once found Laura in their mother's room, holding an old gold locket Emily had been promised as a teenager. "That was Mom's gift to me," Emily had said quietly. Laura had looked at the necklace, then at Emily, and smiled with poisonous calm. "Then you should have held on to it better." Emily took it from her, hands shaking, and walked away before the tears started. That was how she survived in those years, by walking away before they saw the damage. But even in pain, she noticed things. She noticed how Graham's gaze lingered too long on Laura. She noticed how Laura softened around him in ways that weren't sisterly. She noticed missed calls, deleted messages, shared jokes that ended when she entered a room. One afternoon, crossing the back garden, she rounded a hedge and saw their hands brush together, then clasp, quickly, intimately, like a habit they had rehearsed. The world did not explode. The sky did not crack. Nothing dramatic happened at all. That was the terrible thing. Life kept going. Birds still moved in the trees. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. And Emily stood there learning that betrayal often arrives without thunder. Sometimes it comes in the most ordinary silence of your life. She backed away before they saw her. That evening, Laura found her in the hallway and touched her arm lightly. "You look pale," she said. "Are you feeling all right?" Emily stared at her, wondering how a face could look so kind while hiding something so rotten. "I'm fine," she said. Laura smiled. "Good. We all need to be at our best in the coming days." In the coming days. Even then, there had been triumph in her eyes. The will reading had already been scheduled. Simon announced it like a coronation. Ava reacted like a woman selecting jewelry before a gala. Laura pretended not to care, which only meant she cared desperately. Graham acted as if the fortune were already his by extension. Emily said very little, but she watched all of them sharpen around the idea of inheritance. And something inside her finally stopped expecting fairness from people who had long since stopped pretending to be decent. The house changed in the days leading up to the reading. Cruelty became bolder when greed felt close enough to taste. At breakfast, Simon dropped into a chair across from Emily and said, "You know when the will is read, you'll have no place here, right?" Emily lowered her teacup carefully. "That's not for you to decide." He leaned in. "No, but I'll enjoy watching it happen anyway." Ava entered a few minutes later in silk and diamonds, the sort of person who could make a room feel smaller simply by filling it with herself. Her eyes skimmed over Emily's blouse and skirt with instant disdain. "If you insist on coming to the reading, at least try not to look like hired help." Laura came last, all soft perfume and careful concern. She bent close enough that only Emily could hear her. "You should be grateful Graham stayed this long," she whispered. "Not every man has his patience." Then Graham walked in, saw Laura first, and smiled. That smile told Emily everything. She spent that afternoon in her room with an old leather box she had hidden for years in the back of a wardrobe, wrapped in a wool shawl that had belonged to her mother. The box had been given to her months before the accident, with instructions she hadn't fully understood at the time. "Only open it when you truly need to remember who you are," her mother had said. Emily had never opened it. Not after the funeral. Not after the marriage began to crack. Not after the first undeniable proof of betrayal. Some part of her had feared that if she opened it too soon, it would mean accepting that the life she had hoped to save was already gone. Now, seated on the edge of her bed while laughter drifted faintly from another part of the house, she lifted the lid. Inside were letters. Pages written in her mother's hand. Notes in her father's steady script. A sealed envelope marked with her name. And beneath them, nestled carefully in velvet, a small digital recorder. Emily touched the top letter with reverent fingers. My dearest Emily, if you are reading this, it means the world as we knew it has changed. She couldn't read beyond that at first. Her vision blurred too quickly. By the time she reached the line that said, never let their cruelty define you, she was crying so hard she had to press her knuckles to her mouth to stay quiet. By the time she reached, you are not the weakest among them. You are the one with the strongest reason to remain human. Something had shifted. Not healed. Shifted. There is a difference. She read long enough to remember that her parents had seen her clearly. Long enough to feel, for the first time in years, that silence did not have to mean helplessness. Long enough to understand that being underestimated is sometimes the best cover a person can have. That night, she heard voices outside her door. Simon's low and vicious. Ava's cold. Laura's soft and smug. And then, Graham. Not speaking to her, never speaking for her, speaking about her. Once this is over, Graham said, I'm done. Laura laughed under her breath. You should have been done already. Emily sat motionless on the bed, the letter in her lap, the leather box beside her, and listened to the people closest to her discuss the end of her life in that family, as though they were arranging flowers for a dinner party. She did not sleep much after that. She thought. She remembered her father teaching her to play chess in the library. The loudest player is usually the least dangerous, he told her once. Watch the quiet one. The quiet one is thinking. For years, everyone in that house had assumed Emily was not thinking. They were going to regret that. If you're still with me, this is the perfect spot to subscribe, because Emily's story is only getting darker, and the payoff is worth every second. The next morning brought a fresh humiliation. Emily found a hotel receipt in Graham's jacket while sorting laundry. Paid in cash. 1 room. Late check-in. No names, but the date matched the evening he told her he was helping Simon with estate papers. In his car that same week, she found a small perfume bottle tucked beneath the passenger seat. Laura's perfume. The same brand. The same sharp floral scent that used to linger in hallways after Laura passed by. When Graham came home that night, Emily stood in the kitchen with both items in her hand. What is this? She asked. He barely looked at them. You went through my things? Her pulse pounded. That's all you have to say? He snatched the receipt from her fingers. I have a lot to say, actually, starting with how pathetic this is. She stared at him, as if sheer disbelief could strip the lie from his face. His expression hardened. Do you know what your problem is, Emily? You're boring, lonely, and desperate for drama, so you invent it. You sit in this house all day with nothing meaningful to do, then you start imagining betrayals because it makes your life feel less empty. That perfume was Laura's. And this receipt means nothing. He stepped closer, lowering his voice into the cold, controlled tone she had come to fear most. If you keep pushing this, I will leave. And do you know what your family will do when I'm gone? They'll laugh. They already think you're a failure. The only difference is that with me gone, they'll say it to your face. The cruelty in him had become so practiced, he no longer even raised his voice for the worst of it. Emily's hand trembled. Why are you doing this to me? He gave a short, humorless laugh. Because someone should have told you a long time ago what you are. Then he walked past her and upstairs, leaving the kitchen full of silence and detergent and the smell of someone else's perfume still trapped in the air. That was the night Emily stopped hoping for confession. From then on, she wanted clarity. She began paying attention with purpose. She revisited ledgers in her father's old study. She spoke quietly with the estate manager, a man named Mr. Reeves, who had served the family so long he remembered the children when they were small and honest. He told her things cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence when he realized she was asking the questions no one else cared enough to ask. Your father trusted your judgment, he told her one afternoon while they stood near the greenhouse. Not because you were the softest, because you were the only one who saw the staff as people. She looked down. Then why did he never say that plainly? Mr. Reeves gave her a sad smile. He did, many times. They just spoke too loudly to hear him. That answer stayed with her. She found copies of older account summaries. She noticed missing amounts that didn't match official reports. She found documents filed out of order. Nothing she could fully prove yet, but enough to know that Simon's confidence was built on more than arrogance. Ava's spending was far beyond what she should have had access to. Laura had been moving through rooms she had no reason to enter. Graham had become far too comfortable discussing estate matters for a man who legally controlled none of them. One evening, Emily placed a small recorder beneath the guest room dresser. Not because she had become vindictive, because she had finally accepted that decent people sometimes have to gather proof in order to survive indecent ones. She didn't know whether it would capture anything useful. She only knew instinct had kept her alive this long, and instinct was screaming now. That same night, her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. Don't go to the guest room tonight. She read it twice, then a third time. She sat on the edge of the bed listening. A door opened down the hall. Quiet footsteps. Then, muffled laughter she recognized immediately. Laura. Then Graham's voice. Emily closed her eyes. She had all the confirmation she needed. The next morning there was an envelope on her writing desk. No note, no return name. Inside was a photograph. Grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Graham and Laura in an embrace too intimate to explain away. His mouth against hers, one of her hands at the back of his neck. Emily sat down because her knees had gone weak. Someone in the house knew. Someone had seen enough to risk putting the truth in her hands. She slid the photograph into the leather box beneath her mother's letters and sat for a long time in absolute stillness. Not from indecision, from transformation. Pain had reached a point where it was no longer just pain. It was fuel. By the day of the will reading, the Carter estate looked polished enough to host royalty. The chandeliers had been cleaned, silver gleamed. Fresh flowers had been arranged in white stone vases along the hall. The drawing room smelled faintly of waxed wood, roses, and expensive perfume. Family portraits watched from the walls with stern, oil-painted judgment. Cousins gathered in discreet clusters. The attorney, Mr. Thompson, stood by the table with a thick folder in hand and the expression of a man who knew he would rather be almost anywhere else. Simon was the first to arrive, carrying himself with the easy entitlement of someone who had mistaken access for ownership his whole life. Ava followed in a fitted cream dress and heirloom earrings she had already mentally claimed as permanent. Laura drifted in, wearing innocence like couture. Graham took a chair near her, not near Emily. That detail did not go unnoticed. Emily entered last. She wore black, simple and elegant, not for show but because mourning, unlike greed, had never really left her. The room barely acknowledged her presence. Simon looked past her. Ava inspected her. Laura smiled sadly, as if she were already preparing to console the woman she planned to destroy. Graham didn't bother hiding his boredom. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and began. The reading moved slowly, almost cruelly so. A painting to one cousin, a trust for an old employee, jewelry allocations, small sums, carefully named keepsakes. Every line tightened the room further. Simon received a minority share in the company. Ava received family jewelry and the lake house. Laura received a modest trust to be distributed in stages. Each reacted exactly as greed predicts. Simon smug, Ava pleased, Laura briefly disappointed before disguising it. Emily's name had not yet been called. She felt Graham's satisfaction before she heard it in his breathing. Then he stood. "Before this continues," he said, raising his glass, "I think we should finally acknowledge what everyone here knows." Mr. Thompson's jaw tightened. "Mr. Ellis, this is not the time." "Oh, I think it is." He turned to Emily, smiled, delivered the line that would later echo through everyone in that room as the sound of a man destroying himself. "You are such a weak, pathetic excuse for a wife. A burden I can't stand to look at. Honestly, Emily, how did I end up married to someone so completely beneath me?" The room inhaled as one. Ava laughed outright. Simon smirked. Laura brought her fingers to her lips as if shocked, but her eyes glittered. Emily's face went white, then calm. She looked at Graham fully for the first time that morning. Not with pain, not with pleading, with recognition. It unsettled him, though he would never have admitted it. Mr. Thompson, with visible effort, returned to the final pages. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the last clause, and paused. His expression changed. The room noticed. A hush fell so quickly it felt almost orchestrated. He began to read. "To our daughter, Emily Carter, we leave the Carter estate, all controlling shares of Carter Holdings, all major investment accounts, stewardship of the family foundation, and all remaining assets not otherwise designated." Nothing happened for half a second. Then everything happened at once. Ava's glass shattered on the marble floor. Simon shot to his feet so fast his chair nearly toppled backward. Laura's mouth opened, then remained open as if language itself had abandoned her. And Graham's face emptied in real time. Not anger first, not denial. Pure shock. The shock of a man realizing he had just publicly humiliated the only person in the room with the power to ruin him. "What?" Simon barked. Ava looked at the attorney as if he had committed a personal insult. "That's impossible. There must be some mistake," Laura said, though her voice had lost all sweetness. "There is no mistake," Mr. Thompson replied. "This is the final, legally verified will of Mr. and Mrs. Carter." Graham turned on Emily so fast it was almost desperate. "You manipulated them." Emily said nothing. Simon lunged toward the table. "Show me that document." Mr. Thompson shut the folder. "Sit down." Chaos exploded. Accusations, shouting, denials. Ava demanding clarification, Simon cursing, Laura pacing, Graham calling the will fraudulent, outrageous, insane. Cousins whispering behind raised hands, staff members staring carefully at the floor so no one could accuse them of witnessing too much. Emily remained seated. Not because she was overwhelmed, Because for the first time in years, she had no need to chase control. Control had come to her. Simon pointed at the leather box beside her chair. "Open that. Whatever's in there, open it." Every face turned toward it. Emily placed one hand on the lid and felt something like her mother's presence move through her. Not as ghostly fantasy, but as memory strong enough to steady bone. She opened it. Inside were the letters. And the recorder. The room quieted again. "What is that?" Ava whispered. Emily lifted the top note, but before she could read, Mr. Thompson spoke. "Your parents left additional materials to be reviewed in the event of dispute." Simon paled. Laura's shoulders tightened. Graham took a step back. Emily placed the recorder on the table. "Play it," Simon snapped. But there was fear under the anger now. Mr. Thompson pressed the button. Their father's voice filled the room. Not weak, not fading. Strong, measured, unmistakable. "If you are hearing this, then our final wishes are being challenged. To our children, know this. We loved each of you. But love does not require blindness. We saw the greed growing in this family. We saw dishonesty. We saw entitlement. And we prepared accordingly." No one moved. Only Emily remained loyal without asking what loyalty would earn her. Only Emily showed concern for the people, the legacy, and the responsibility beyond the money itself. That is why she has been chosen. Ava's hand flew to her mouth. Simon stared as if force of will alone could stop the recording. Their father continued. "Any attempt to manipulate, bribe, alter, conceal, or contest through deception will trigger further disclosures already entrusted to counsel." The recording clicked off. No one breathed for a beat. Then, all at once, the air in the room changed. This was no longer a family disappointed by inheritance. This was a family exposed by it. If this twist got you, hit like and subscribe, because Emily isn't even close to finished, and what she does with that power is even better. Simon recovered first, if rage could be called recovery. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "She doesn't deserve any of it." Emily lifted her eyes to him. Something in her gaze made him falter. For years he had looked at her and seen softness he could dominate. Now he was looking at still water and realizing there was depth beneath it he had never measured. Ava was next. "You manipulated them emotionally. That's what this is. You played the helpless daughter, and they fell for it." Emily stood. It wasn't dramatic. She simply rose. And because no one in that house had seen her rise with certainty in years, the room leaned around the movement, as if witnessing something unnatural. "I never asked them for anything," she said quietly. "That may be difficult for some of you to understand." Laura scoffed, though she would not meet Emily's eyes. "You expect us to believe they gave you everything because you're virtuous?" "No," Emily said. "I expect you to believe they gave me everything because they knew exactly who you are." The words landed like a slap. Graham found his voice then, sharp with panic. "Emily, this isn't you." She turned to him. "No," she said. "It's exactly me. You just never cared enough to see." His mouth tightened. "You can't run a company. You can barely manage yourself." A low murmur passed through the room. It was meant to humiliate her. Instead, it sounded stale. Emily looked at him almost with pity. "You spent years mistaking my refusal to become cruel for an inability to become strong." He tried to laugh. It failed halfway. Mr. Thompson placed another set of papers on the table. "There are documents regarding irregular financial activity, unauthorized access to estate materials, and evidence of private interference in pre-reading processes. We can review those now if necessary." Simon's face drained. Ava's eyes flashed toward him. Laura stepped backward. Emily noticed all of it. So had her parents. The next day, Mr. Thompson requested everyone return to the drawing room for what he described as a formal review of supplemental estate conditions. No one refused. No one dared. Word had spread through the house overnight. Staff moved with a new alertness. Cousins arrived early. The atmosphere no longer resembled a mourning family. It felt like the courthouse before sentencing. Emily did not dress in mourning this time. She wore deep navy, the color of a night sky that knows dawn is coming. No glitter, no excess. Nothing designed to impress anyone. Her power no longer needed decoration. When she entered, conversations stopped. Simon sat rigid with fury. Ava looked as though she had not slept. Laura's elegance had cracks in it now. Graham looked ruined around the edges, tie slightly crooked, jaw unshaven, eyes carrying the strain of a man whose future had turned in a single afternoon. Mr. Thompson began with the ledgers. Carefully, methodically, devastatingly. Missing funds tied to Simon. Luxury charges routed through accounts Ava had no right to access. Document movement and tampering connected to Laura. Attempts by Graham to position himself for future influence under the assumption that Emily would receive little or nothing. The evidence did not arrive as one explosive reveal. It arrived in pages, timestamps, account trails, witness statements, and signed certifications. The dull, deadly kind of truth that leaves very little room for performance. Simon slammed both hands on the table. "This proves nothing." Emily slid a copied ledger toward him. "It proves you siphoned money from the company while claiming Dad trusted you most with the business." He looked at the numbers and said nothing. "You always called me dead weight," she continued. "But I was never the one bleeding this family dry." Ava's turn came next. The offshore account records were placed before her with all the elegance of a knife laid down between courses. Her voice came out high and thin. "I was preserving assets." "You were hiding them," Emily said. "For the family. For yourself." Ava laughed then, but it carried too much panic to sound convincing. "You're jealous. You always were." Emily tilted her head. "Of what? Your jewelry? Your mirrors? Your need to be envied by people who don't even like you?" Ava's eyes filled with furious tears. I've already initiated a freeze on all Carter-funded cards, accounts, and privileges connected to unauthorized usage, Emily said. By the end of the day, everything you've been flaunting on stolen confidence will be inaccessible. Ava went silent. Laura tried a different strategy. She stood slowly, every movement composed for sympathy. Emily, we are sisters. Whatever mistakes were made, we can still work this out privately. Emily looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into the leather box and placed the photograph on the table. The room reacted instantly. Soft exclamations. A cousin muttering, "Oh my God." One of the maids inhaling sharply before catching herself. Laura went white. Graham closed his eyes briefly, as if not seeing it might undo it. Emily's voice stayed calm. You looked me in the eye and called yourself family while sleeping with my husband. Laura swallowed. That photo doesn't show, it shows enough. It was a mistake. No, Emily said. It was a choice, probably many. Laura's mouth trembled. For once, she had no beautiful lie ready. Emily continued. You wanted influence. You wanted status. You wanted a man you believed would stand beside the next Carter heir. What you actually wanted was proximity to power. Now you can learn what responsibility feels like without glamour attached. Mr. Thompson slid another document forward. Emily did not look away from Laura. You are being assigned operational oversight of the Western branch under supervision. It's failing. If you can save it through actual work, I'll know there is at least one useful bone in your body. If you can't, you'll fail in full public view without hiding behind charity luncheons and borrowed diamonds. Laura stared at her in disbelief. You can't do that. I already did. Graham rose abruptly. This is insane. Emily turned toward him last. That was deliberate, because some betrayals deserve to wait and watch while justice passes over everyone else first. He straightened, as if preparing for a confrontation he could dominate. Habit. Reflex. Delusion. Emily laid out the hotel receipt, the perfume bottle, a printed copy of phone records, the photograph. You humiliated me publicly because you believed I was about to become irrelevant, she said. You stood in my family's house and called me worthless because you thought wealth was about to leave me and move toward you through someone else. His face flushed dark. You don't understand how things looked. She nearly smiled at that. That sentence belongs to frightened men. He tried again, softer now. Emily, listen. We can talk about this privately. No. The single word cut cleaner than a shout. You don't get private after what you made public. The room went still. For years, Emily said, you insulted me in front of anyone willing to watch. You made cruelty your language because you thought it made you powerful. So hear me clearly in front of the same audience you enjoyed so much. You have no claim here. No protection. No place in this family. The legal team has already begun severing every financial tie connected to my inheritance and the Carter estate. Your access ends now. His voice cracked. You're throwing me away over one mistake? She stared at him. One mistake? She repeated quietly. You spent years trying to make me feel small enough to excuse what you were. He took a step toward her. I was frustrated. You were vicious. You were impossible to love. Something flickered across Emily's face then. Not hurt. Recognition. Final recognition. No, she said. I was simply inconvenient to a man who wanted worship without accountability. Graham's jaw tightened so hard a vein rose at his temple. You'll regret this. Emily stepped closer. It was the closest she had stood to him in months. You made one fatal mistake, she said, low enough that everyone leaned in to hear. You taught me exactly what I should never tolerate again. Then she stepped back. And in stepping back, she took the last of his imagined authority with her. Mr. Thompson closed the folder in front of him. As of this morning, Emily Carter is the sole acting authority over Carter Holdings and all associated properties, trusts, and directives. The estate conditions are enforceable. Challenges based on bad faith claims will trigger public filing of all reviewed evidence. Simon sank into his chair like a man whose anger could no longer hold up the weight of consequences. Ava looked at the ceiling, as though appeal might descend from it. Laura cried quietly, but even her tears no longer drew rescue. Graham stood alone in the center of the room, the way cruel men always do when the crowd stops confusing their confidence for substance. Emily did not feel triumph in the way novels describe it. No rush of joy, no swelling revenge. What she felt was cleaner than that. Release, and underneath it, grief. Because justice does not resurrect what betrayal kills. It only ends the lie that betrayal should go unanswered. In the days that followed, Emily moved quickly. That surprised them most of all. They had expected sentiment, hesitation, fragility. Instead, she met with attorneys, auditors, foundation directors, senior staff, and branch managers. She read everything, asked specific questions, reopened programs Simon had slashed to improve optics, restored pensions, expanded scholarships in her mother's name, released bonuses her father had promised employees before his death, ordered a full internal review of vendor relationships and silent account diversions, reorganized leadership, cut away parasites dressed as executives. The company stabilized faster than anyone expected. Because Emily had not been absent from understanding all those years. She had been excluded from it. And exclusion is not the same thing as incapacity. Mr. Reeves, the estate manager, found her one evening in the rose garden her mother had loved. Sunset lit the gravel path in soft gold. The house behind them looked less like a fortress now, and more like a building finally forced to tell the truth about what had happened inside it. "Your father would be proud," he said. Emily looked toward the windows. "I hope my mother would think I was merciful." Mr. Reeves considered that. Mercy doesn't mean protecting people from consequences. Sometimes mercy is refusing to become like them while you deliver those consequences. She smiled faintly. That was the balance she wanted. Not destruction for pleasure. Order, accountability, repair. Simon was removed from all business authority, but given a modest personal allowance contingent on compliance and treatment for the rage he had spent years worshipping as strength. He called it humiliation. Emily called it more mercy than he had ever shown anyone else. Ava lost access to luxury funded by family money. Stripped of the constant applause of appearances, she discovered that charm without resources attracts very few loyal companions. Emily did not exile her. She simply stopped financing her illusions. Laura took the Western branch. At first, everyone assumed she would fail within weeks. To Emily's astonishment, the fear of public collapse did what affection and indulgence never had. It made Laura work. Not nobly, not beautifully, but work nonetheless. Sometimes consequences are the first honest teacher a spoiled person ever meets. As for Graham, the divorce was swift. He fought in the beginning. Men like him always do. Not because they are heartbroken, but because losing control feels to them like an injury. Yet the evidence was too clear, his leverage too thin, his standing too dependent on a family name that no longer covered him. When he finally came to the house to collect the last of his things, he found Emily in the library. The same library where her father had taught her chess. The late afternoon light fell across shelves and polished brass. She stood by the desk signing documents, calm as weather. He lingered near the doorway as though waiting for her to soften. "Emily?" She looked up. "You shouldn't be here without notice." He swallowed. "I just wanted to say, maybe everything got out of hand." She set the pen down. Maybe. Such a small word for years of damage. He took another step. "I know I hurt you." "Yes. I wasn't myself." "You were exactly yourself. That was the problem." He flinched. It was subtle, but she saw it. For the first time, he was speaking to someone who would not carry his excuses for him. "There was pressure," he said. "Your family. My family didn't force you to enjoy humiliating me." He opened his mouth, closed it. She walked toward him then, not with hostility, but with finality. "I spent too long believing if I were gentler, quieter, easier, someone like you would become kinder. But cruelty does not soften when accommodated. It expands." He looked at her as if he were only now understanding who she had always been. "I did love you," he said weakly. Emily's expression did not change. "No," she said. "You loved being admired by someone who didn't yet know better." He stood there in the ruins of every tactic that had once worked on her. Guilt, charm, self-pity, revision. None of it could reach her anymore. "If you had apologized before you were powerless," she said, "I might have believed you were sorry." Then she turned back to the desk. That was all. And because it was all, it was devastating. He left with a box of clothes and whatever remained of his pride. If you've made it this far, subscribe now, because stories like this aren't just about revenge. They're about the moment a broken person realizes they were never as powerless as the world wanted them to believe. Winter passed. Spring came back to the Carter estate in a way Emily had not thought possible. Windows opened again. Staff laughed more freely. Fresh interns arrived through the scholarship program. The foundation resumed community work her mother had cared about deeply. Women's shelters, school grants, small business assistance for widows, healthcare partnerships in overlooked parts of the county. The house still held difficult memories, but memory loses some of its poison when it no longer controls the future. One afternoon, Emily found herself in the kitchen where her mother used to bake. She rolled up her sleeves and made bread with the cook, laughing quietly when the flour ended up on her cheek. A maid passing through froze for a second, then smiled. That simple smile nearly undid her. Because healing does not always announce itself grandly. Sometimes it arrives as the return of ordinary tenderness. She read her mother's letters often after that. One line became a kind of compass. Power, tempered by mercy, is the truest inheritance. She understood it better now. Power without mercy becomes Simon. Mercy without power becomes surrender. But together? Together, they become stewardship. That was what her parents had really left her. Not just money, not just property. Stewardship. The responsibility to hold what others would have exploited and shape it into something cleaner than greed. On the anniversary of the will reading, Emily held a formal gathering at the estate. Not a celebration, a recommitment. Employees, community partners, scholarship recipients, legal advisors, and extended family were invited. The chandeliers shone again, but the room felt different now. Honest. Earned. Simon attended. Quiet for once. Ava came dressed elegantly, but with none of her former arrogance. Laura arrived late from the Western branch, exhausted and less polished than she would once have tolerated. Yet there was something almost human in her face now. Consequences had not turned her kind, but they had forced her to become real. Emily saw all of them. She also saw what they still could not fully admit. None of them had expected her to endure, let alone lead. When she spoke that evening, she did not mention revenge. She spoke of legacy, of accountability, of service, of what wealth becomes when divorced from conscience, and what a family loses when love turns competitive. She thanked those who had remained loyal to the company and the foundation through unstable years. She announced expanded grants in both her parents' names. She created a leadership initiative for women who had survived domestic and financial abuse, because she now understood too clearly how dependence can be engineered and how dignity can be slowly starved. The applause that followed was not the shallow kind her siblings used to chase. It was respect. And respect, Emily learned, sounds different. It carries weight. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the last glasses had been cleared, Emily stood alone for a moment in the drawing room where Graham had once called her worthless. Moonlight touched the floor in silver bands. The portraits on the walls looked less severe now. Or maybe she simply no longer feared being judged by the dead when she had finally stopped living for the approval of the cruel. She remembered the sound of his voice that day. The smirk. The certainty. And then she remembered the silence after the will was read. That silence had not been empty. It had been a door opening. A doorway out of shame. Out of illusion. Out of the story everyone else had written for her. She walked to the window and looked out over the grounds. Somewhere beyond the trees, the future waited. Not perfect. Not painless. But hers. She thought of the woman she had been in the early years after her parents died. Soft-spoken, cornered, apologizing for taking up space in rooms built by her own blood. She wished she could go back and place a hand on that younger self's shoulder and tell her the truth. You are not hard to love. You are surrounded by people who do not know how. She would tell her this, too. One day, the people who laugh at your silence will learn that silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it is survival gathering strength. Sometimes it is wisdom refusing to perform for fools. Sometimes it is the pause before life turns in your favor so completely that the ones who buried you are forced to watch you rise. Emily closed her eyes and saw her mother in the kitchen again, her father in the library. Warmth where cold had ruled too long. When she opened them, she did not feel like a victim who had won. She felt like a woman who had returned to herself. And that, more than the estate, more than the fortune, more than the company, was the inheritance no one could steal. By the time summer returned, the Carter name no longer inspired whispers about scandal alone. It was attached to new schools, rebuilt housing, employee ownership incentives, expanded family leave, a legal fund for women trying to leave abusive marriages. Emily funded it quietly at first, then publicly when she understood how many people needed to hear someone say the words plainly. What was done to you is not your shame. That message spread further than she expected. Letters arrived from women she had never met. Some wrote about cruel husbands, some about siblings who used dependence as a leash, some about being treated as ornamental until they were no longer useful. Emily read every letter that crossed her desk. She replied to as many as she could. Not as a saint, as a witness. Because surviving humiliation changes the way you recognize it in others. On certain days, Simon still glared at her across conference reports. Ava still resented every practical dress and every unadorned choice Emily made. Laura still oscillated between defensive and subdued. None of them became miraculous people overnight. That was fine. Emily did not need their transformation in order to validate her own. And that was perhaps the final freedom. To stop needing your abusers to understand what they did before you allow yourself to heal. One rainy evening, long after the house had quieted, Emily sat in the library and replayed the old recorder one last time. Her father's voice filled the room. Her mother's followed. She listened without tears this time. When the message ended, she placed the recorder back in the leather box and smiled. They had not saved her. They had reminded her. There's a difference. No inheritance creates strength where none exists. It simply reveals what was already there when the pressure became unbearable. Emily had always been strong. She had simply been surrounded by people who benefited from pretending she wasn't. And in the end, that became their downfall. Because the husband who called her worthless lost everything by speaking too soon. The siblings who mocked her discovered that entitlement is not the same as worth. The family that mistook kindness for weakness learned too late that restraint is not surrender. And the woman they tried to humiliate out of existence became the one person capable of carrying the Carter name without poisoning it. So if anyone ever asks how a quiet woman took back an empire from the people who thought she would always stay small, the answer is simple. She didn't become ruthless. She became clear. Clear about who had betrayed her. Clear about what she would never tolerate again. Clear about the difference between mercy and permission. Clear about the fact that surviving people who call you weak is often the first sign that you were stronger than all of them from the very beginning. And when the moment finally came, when the room went silent, when the will was read, When the truth stepped fully into the light, Emily Carter did not need to raise her voice to win. She only needed to stand. And once she stood, everyone who had spent years looking down on her had no choice but to look up.